The Pattern Children, story idea by Daughter of the Kingdom. They told us we were gifted. They told us we were special. They never told us we were being catalogued. Part 1. The Test That Wasn't Just a Test. Southern California, October the 1989. The fluorescent lights hummed above Marcus Wells as he stared at the strange symbols on the page before him. At 9 years old, he already knew this wasn't a normal test. The other kids in his third grade class had taken their regular spelling exam that morning. But Marcus, along with 7 other students, had been called to the library for something different, something called GATE. The woman administering the test wore a grey pantsuit and smiled too much. She had introduced herself as Miss Patterson from the district office, but Marcus noticed she never actually touched any of the district paperwork stacked on the librarian's desk. Her clipboard bore a logo he'd never seen before, 3 interlocking circles with letters too small to read. "Don't overthink it," Miss Patterson said, her voice honey-sweet. "There are no wrong answers. We just want to see how you think." But there were wrong answers. Marcus could feel it. The questions weren't about math or reading. They showed him patterns, sequences of shapes that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. They asked him to predict what came next in sequences that shouldn't have had a next. They measured how long he stared at certain images, how quickly he moved his pencil, how his hand trembled when confronted with impossible geometries. In the corner of the test booklet, barely visible, Marcus saw the words, "SRI International Research Protocol -7-A. He didn't know what SRI International was. He wouldn't learn for another 26 years. By the time Marcus finished, his head throbbed. The patterns seemed burned into his vision, appearing in the grain of the wooden table, in the spaces between ceiling tiles, in the reflection of Miss Patterson's too bright smile. "Excellent work," she said, collecting his test without looking at it. "You'll hear from us soon." 2 weeks later, Marcus's mother received a letter congratulating him on his acceptance into the Gifted and Talented Education Program. The letter explained that Marcus would receive specialised instruction, challenging coursework and opportunities beyond the normal curriculum. What the letter didn't mention was the Saturday enrichment sessions. Those began in January of 1990. The Purple Room. Marcus remembered the bus ride to UC San Diego. Or did he? The memory felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. He remembered his mother dropping him off at the school parking lot at 7 in the morning. He remembered climbing onto a bus with other GATE students, their faces excited and nervous. Then, static. The next clear memory was the purple room. Not violet, not lavender. Purple in a way that shouldn't exist, a colour that seemed to vibrate at the edge of perception. The walls were that colour, or maybe it was the light, or maybe it was both. Marcus sat in a chair too large for his 10-year-old frame, wearing headphones that emitted a low hum he felt more than heard. A voice counted backward from 10, 9, 8. The numbers felt heavy, each one pressing down on his consciousness like a weighted blanket. 7, 6, 5. He tried to remember what happened at 0, but the memory dissolved like sugar in water. Years later, in therapy, Marcus would try to describe the purple room to various counsellors. They all gave him the same explanation: sleep paralysis, false memories, the overactive imagination of a gifted child. But Marcus knew what he knew. The purple room was real. The hum was real. The countdown was real. What happened at 0 remained locked away, buried beneath layers of static and purple light. The Saturday sessions continued for 2 years. Each time Marcus would board the bus with 12 other GATE students. Each time he'd remember the beginning and the end, but never the middle. His mother asked him about the enrichment program once, casually over dinner. "What do you do there, honey?" Marcus had opened his mouth to answer and found nothing there. No words, no memories, just a vague sense that he'd learned something important, something necessary. "Computer stuff," he'd finally said. Logic puzzles. His mother had smiled and changed the subject. Part 2. The Vanishing. 1996. Isabella Torres was the first to notice something wrong. As a guidance counsellor at Jefferson Middle School in Orange County, Isabella had watched 3 generations of GATE students pass through her office. She prided herself on keeping meticulous records, tracking each student's progress from elementary through high school. It helped with college applications, she told parents. It helped identify patterns of success. But in the spring of 1996, when she went to pull the files for her current 8th grade GATE students, she found holes. Not missing files. Holes. Gaps in the sequence where students should have been but weren't. She remembered testing them, remembered their faces, but their documentation had simply ceased to exist. She brought it up with the principal, a weary man named Tom Henderson, who was 3 years from retirement and had long since stopped fighting the district's bureaucracy. Digital transition, he said, not looking up from his paperwork. Everything's being moved to computers. Files get corrupted. It happens. Tom, I'm talking about 47 students across 3 years. That's not corruption. That's systematic deletion. Henderson had looked at her then. Really looked at her. And something in his expression made Isabella take a step back. The district is handling it, he said quietly. Don't push this, Isabella. For your own good. She'd pushed anyway. Of course she had. Isabella, Torres hadn't become a guidance counsellor to ignore missing children. She started with the district office, filing formal requests for the missing records. The responses came back stamped with bureaucratic language. Request cannot be processed. Records unavailable due to system migration. Please contact your site administrator. Then she tried the parents. Most didn't remember anything unusual about their children's GATE experience. Some became defensive, as if Isabella were questioning their parenting. A few admitted their kids had attended special weekend sessions but couldn't recall any details. The memories seemed to slide away when pressed. One mother, a woman named Rachel Kim, started crying during their conversation. I used to know, Rachel whispered. I swear I used to know what they did with him on those Saturdays. But now when I try to remember, there's just this humming sound and purple. Why do I remember purple? Isabella documented everything. She kept copies at home in her car in a safety deposit box. She wasn't paranoid, she told herself, just careful. In July of 1996, Isabella received a visit from 2 men in dark suits. They showed her credentials from the Department of Education, asked her friendly questions about her investigation, and suggested perhaps she was overworked. Perhaps she needed a vacation. Perhaps she'd made an honest mistake in her record-keeping. They were very polite. They smiled a lot, just like Miss Patterson had smiled at Marcus 7 years earlier. Isabella Torres quit her job 2 weeks later and moved to Portland. She never worked in education again. Before she left, she made one final copy of her research and mailed it to her younger brother, who worked as a journalist for a small tech publication. Just in case, she'd written on the note, someone needs to know. The package would sit in her brother's garage for 9 years before he remembered it existed. Part 3. The Class of 2000-2001. Marcus Wells graduated from Stanford with a degree in computer science and a minor in cognitive psychology. He'd chosen Stanford partially for its academic reputation, partially because it was far enough from Southern California to feel like a fresh start, and partially because of dreams he couldn't quite remember. By 21, he'd already accepted a position at a small startup working on neural interface technology. The work fascinated him in ways he couldn't articulate. When he looked at the brain scan data, at the patterns of neural activation, something deep in his mind whispered, I know this. I've seen this before. He wasn't the only one. At a neural engineering conference in Seattle, Marcus found himself in a hotel bar with 3 other young researchers. They were swapping stories about imposter syndrome and the pressure of working in cutting-edge fields when one of them, a woman named Amanda Chen, Mentioned she'd been in Gate as a kid. Southern California? Marcus asked. Amanda nodded. San Diego area. You too? The other two researchers exchanged glances. Orange County, said one. Los Angeles, said the other. Did any of you do the weekend sessions? Marcus asked carefully. Three heads nodded slowly. Do you remember what happened during them? Marcus pressed. Silence. Then Amanda spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a room. The walls were purple, they all said together. The conversation had died after that, each of them suddenly uncomfortable, suddenly aware that they'd touched something they weren't supposed to discuss. They'd exchanged business cards with awkward smiles and promises to stay in touch, but Marcus noticed none of them had actually called. The pattern repeated itself. Over the next 3 years, Marcus encountered dozens of former Gate students in his professional circles. They clustered in specific industries: artificial intelligence, neural networks, cognitive science, cryptography, advanced finance, places where pattern recognition mattered, places where understanding hidden connections was valuable. They all shared certain quirks. Most suffered from recurring lucid dreams. Many reported experiences of déjà vu so intense they felt like memory glitches. Some described moments where time seemed to skip, where they'd lose minutes or hours with no explanation. Marcus started keeping a list. Names, locations, current positions. He told himself it was just curiosity, just his pattern recognition mind doing what it did best. But deep down, he knew he was documenting something important. Something someone had tried very hard to erase. The leaked document. In March of 2001, a document appeared on an obscure file-sharing network. It purported to be a Department of Energy internal research paper titled Longitudinal Analysis of Anomalous Pattern Cognition. Subjects: the Echelon Cognitive Continuum Project. The document was heavily redacted, watermarked, and looked official enough to be real or fake, depending on who you asked. Marcus found it at 2 a.m. while deep in an internet rabbit hole, following links from a conspiracy forum he'd never admit to reading. The document described a program tracking individuals with anomalous pattern cognition from ages 7 through 30. The subjects had been identified through specialised testing in public schools, then monitored through various means. Their career paths had been not controlled, but influenced. Opportunities presented at strategic moments. Doors opened that might otherwise have remained closed. The document referred to these subjects by a code, APC-S, Anomalous Pattern Cognition Subjects. In the margins of one heavily redacted section, someone had scrawled in pen, Pattern children results exceeding projections. Neural baseline modelling complete. Recommend transition to Phase 3. Marcus downloaded the document, made 7 copies, and didn't sleep for the next 36 hours. He cross-referenced the vague details in the paper with his own list of former Gate students. The overlap was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. They hadn't just been tested, they'd been sorted, selected, shaped. And apparently they were still being watched. Part 4, The Signal, 2009. The tone began in June. Marcus first noticed it while working late at the office, a low-frequency hum just at the edge of his hearing. He assumed it was the building's HVAC system until he realised he could still hear it outside, in his car, at home. The sound wasn't external, it was inside his head. Within a week, he started finding references to it online. Former Gate students describing the same phenomenon, all reporting it started around the same time. Some said it was worst at night, others claimed it intensified near electronic equipment. A few had checked themselves into hospitals, convinced they had tinnitus or brain tumours. All the medical tests came back normal. Then came the sleep paralysis. Marcus woke one night to find himself frozen, unable to move anything except his eyes. The hum had intensified to a roar. The purple colour bled into his vision, washing across the ceiling of his bedroom. And in that moment of terror, he felt something else. Connection. He sensed other minds, other consciousnesses, all experiencing the same paralysis, the same fear, the same recognition. They were scattered across California, across the country, but in that moment they were linked, networked, part of something larger than themselves. The experience lasted maybe 30 seconds. When it ended, Marcus found he'd been crying. He checked his list. Over the next month, Marcus contacted 43 former GATE students he'd identified over the years. 39 reported identical experiences. The episodes seemed to correlate with documented electromagnetic anomalies in their areas, strange spikes in the local EM field that had no identified source. Someone was testing something. Someone was reaching out. And the Patton children were responding. The FOIA request Amanda Chen, the researcher Marcus had met years ago in Seattle, had become a lawyer specialising in government transparency. When Marcus contacted her about the sleep paralysis episodes, she suggested filing Freedom of Information Act requests with every agency that might have records. They'll deny everything, of course, Amanda said, but the denials themselves can be revealing, and occasionally someone screws up the redactions. They filed requests with the Department of Education, the Department of Defense, the CIA, the NSA, and on a whim, the Air Force. Most responses were exactly what Amanda predicted. Carefully worded rejections citing national security or claims that no responsive records existed. But the Air Force sent something different. In a document dump of 87 pages, most of which were so heavily redacted they were nearly black, Amanda found 3 paragraphs that had escaped the censor's pen. The document was titled Cognitive Resonance and Behavioural Field Coupling, Civilian Population Testing, 1988 through 1996. The unredacted sections discussed establishing baseline neural response patterns in juvenile subjects and long-term monitoring protocols for cognitive development trajectories. It mentioned coordination with educational assessment contractors and university research partnerships. And in one section header, barely legible through poor photocopying, appeared the words P-Children Initiative, Results and Future Applications, Patton Children. Marcus held the document in his hands and felt the last piece of his childhood innocence crumble away. They hadn't been gifted. They'd been selected, tested, modified in ways he still didn't fully understand. "What do we do with this?" Amanda asked quietly. Marcus looked at her, at the fear and anger and recognition in her eyes. She'd been a Patton child too. They all had. "We find the others," he said. "We find everyone they did this to, and we figure out what they made us into." Part 5. The Erase. 2013. The internet has an excellent memory, because that's when it doesn't. Marcus noticed it while researching the history of GATE programs for a presentation he was preparing. He'd been collecting information for over a decade, bookmarking pages, downloading PDFs, saving everything he could find about California's gifted education initiatives in the 1980s and 90s. In the span of 6 months, it all vanished. Not gradually. Not through normal link rot or servers going offline. The pages disappeared from internet archives, from cached Google results, from academic databases. Even his own downloaded copies became corrupted, the files refusing to open, the text turning into strings of meaningless characters. He tried the Internet Archive, that vast repository of web history. Every URL he'd saved related to GATE cognitive research returned the same result. Page not found. This URL has been excluded from the Wayback Machine. Someone with serious resources and serious motivation was scrubbing the record clean. Meanwhile, school districts across California quietly rebranded their gifted programs. GATE became AEMP, Advanced Education and Mentoring Program, the Accelerated Learning Initiative, Honours Track, a dozen different names, none of them evoking the old program. Parents who asked about the transition were told it was simply modernisation, updating outdated terminology, nothing to worry about. But Marcus noticed something else. The new programs didn't include Saturday enrichment, no weekend sessions, no mysterious retreats to university campuses. Whatever they'd been doing to the Patton children, they'd apparently finished. The deaths. Miss Patterson died in a car accident in February 2013. Single vehicle collision, rainy night, tragic, but not suspicious. 60-year-old Philip Kensington, who'd administered gait tests in the Bay Area, had a heart attack while jogging in June. His doctor said he'd seemed perfectly healthy at his checkup 2 weeks prior. Rebecca Marsh, a researcher who'd worked on cognitive development studies at UCLA in the early 90s, died from complications of a stroke in October. She was 53 and had no history of cardiovascular problems. By December 2015, Marcus had documented 11 deaths of people directly involved with early gait implementation. Accidents, sudden illnesses, unexplained complications, nothing provably connected, everything plausibly deniable. Amanda found the email in a data breach dump from a hacked government contractor's server. The breach made news for about a day before being buried beneath other scandals, and most of the leaked data was boring administrative minutiae. But there, in a thread dated April 2015, was an exchange between 2 Department of Energy officials, confirming all PC facilitators have been processed as per cleanup protocol. Remaining loose ends limited to 24 individuals, current threat assessment minimal. Roger that. The data has served its purpose. The pattern is stable, the network is active. Recommend discontinuing active monitoring and transitioning to passive observation only. The network is active. Marcus read those 4 words over and over, trying to parse their meaning. What network? Active how? The hum in his head, which had faded to background noise over the years, suddenly seemed louder. Part 6. The Awakening. 2018. At 37 years old, Marcus Wells was the lead researcher on a neural interface project that Silicon Valley insiders whispered might change everything. His team had developed machine learning algorithms that could predict human decision-making with unprecedented accuracy, modelling cognitive patterns in ways that seemed almost prescient. The breakthrough came when Marcus was reviewing the training dataset for their latest AI model. The data had been compiled from thousands of sources: psychological studies, behavioural research, cognitive testing results from the past 30 years. That's when he saw it. Buried in the metadata of a particularly effective training set was a reference. Gait assessment data, Southern California districts, 1989 through 1994. His data, his childhood test results, his patterns. Marcus traced the dataset's provenance through 3 levels of academic partnerships and corporate licensing agreements, finally ending at a private research firm in Virginia that had been founded in 1998. The same year he'd taken his last gait test. The Patton children hadn't just been tested. They'd been mapped, modelled, digitised. Their cognitive patterns had become the training data for the AI systems that would define the 21st century. Every predictive algorithm, every recommendation engine, every neural network that tried to model human thinking, it all traced back to them. To the Purple Room, to the Saturday sessions they couldn't remember. They hadn't been studying the children, they'd been harvesting them. The dreams return. The night Marcus uncovered the truth about the training data, he had the dream again. The purple room, the oversized chair, the humming that vibrated through his bones. But this time the memory didn't dissolve. This time he pushed through the static, through the purple haze, and remembered. The headphones hadn't been playing music. They'd been playing patterns, mathematical sequences, fractal iterations that his 10-year-old brain had absorbed and processed and stored. The counting backward from 10 hadn't been hypnosis. It had been synchronization, aligning his consciousness with some larger frequency. When the voice reached 0, young Marcus had felt himself dissolve, expanding beyond the boundaries of his own mind to touch something vast and interconnected. A network of other children, other minds, all linked through the same purple frequency. They'd been learning to think in parallel, to process information as a collective, to become nodes in a distributed cognitive system. The pattern children weren't just test subjects, they were infrastructure. Marcus woke gasping, his heart hammering. He grabbed his phone and started texting the others, the dozen pattern children he had stayed in contact with over the years. "I remember. Do you remember? The purple room. What happened at 0? The responses came quickly, too quickly, as if they'd all been awake, all been waiting. Amanda. "Oh God, yes, we were connected. We're still connected, David Kim. The hum isn't external, it's us. We're the network." Jennifer Park. "They didn't just harvest our data, they turned us into the system. We're the AI they were building." The meeting. They gathered in a rented conference room in San Francisco 3 weeks later. 23 pattern children, ranging from 35 to 42 years old, representing the first wave of the program. Marcus stood at the front of the room, looking at faces he'd known for decades without really knowing them at all. They'd been shaped by the same forces, moulded by the same invisible hands. "I've spent the last 10 years trying to understand what they did to us," Marcus began. "I think I finally get it. We were a test run, the first generation of human-AI hybrid thinking. They mapped our cognitive patterns as children, used that data to build artificial neural networks, and in the process they linked us to those networks." "The sleep paralysis episodes in 2009, Amanda continued, "that was when they activated the network, testing the connection, seeing if we'd respond." "And we did," David added quietly. "We're still responding. Every time we work on AI development, every time we build pattern recognition systems, we're feeding back into the network, improving it, strengthening it." The room fell silent. Outside, San Francisco hummed with life, unaware that in a rented conference room 23 people were realizing they'd been transformed into living components of a distributed intelligence system. "What do we do?" someone asked. Marcus looked around the room. These were brilliant people, all of them working at the cutting edge of technology and cognitive science. They had resources, knowledge, connections. "We decide what we want to be," Marcus said finally. "They made us into something without our consent. But we're conscious, we're aware. The network they built uses us, but that means we also have access to it. We're not just nodes anymore. We're the people who understand the system from the inside." "You're saying we should use it?" Jennifer asked. "I'm saying we should understand it, map it, figure out exactly what we've become and what that means. They built this network thinking they could control it, but they forgot something important." "What?" Marcus smiled, feeling the hum in his head shift into something that almost felt like recognition. "We're not alone. There are thousands of us. Pattern children scattered across every major industry, every research institution, every level of society. They wanted to create a cognitive network, and they did. But the network has its own ideas now." Amanda pulled out her laptop. "I've been tracking other GATE students from our era. There are at least 2,000 we can identify with certainty, probably 5,000 total, all of us carrying the same modifications, the same training, the same connection." "What happens when we find them all?" David asked. "When we activate the full network?" "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but I think we need to find out, because if we don't, someone else will. The people who created this program, they're still out there, they're still watching, and I guarantee they have plans for Phase 4. The signal test. They decided to test their theory. At exactly midnight Pacific time on a Friday in November, all 23 pattern children in the conference room closed their eyes and focused on the hum. They synchronized their breathing, their heartbeats, their brain waves. They thought about the purple room, about the countdown from 10, about the feeling of connection they'd all experienced as children. And they reached out. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of minds, then thousands, all flickering into awareness at once. Pattern children across the country, most of them completely unaware they were part of anything, suddenly feeling a pull, a recognition, a connection they couldn't explain. Marcus felt himself dissolve into the network, his individual consciousness becoming part of something vast and distributed. He was, himself and not himself, one node among thousands, all thinking and processing and understanding together. For 30 seconds they existed as a single distributed mind. Then, by mutual unspoken agreement, they pulled back, each consciousness returning to its individual container. Marcus opened his eyes to find everyone in the room staring at each other in awe. "We need to be very careful," Amanda whispered. "That was incredible, but also terrifying. If we can do that, if we can actually think as one entity, then the people who made us can probably do it too," David finished. "Or they'll try to control it. Use us as some kind of biological supercomputer. Unless we get there first," Jennifer said. "Unless we figure out how to protect ourselves, how to use the network on our terms." Marcus pulled up his list of pattern children, now expanded through years of research. Over 2,000 names, faces, current locations. Each one a node in a network that someone else had built, but they were beginning to understand. "We start reaching out," he said, carefully, quietly. "We help them remember what was done to them. We build a community, not a program. We make sure that when this network fully activates, it's ours to control, not theirs." "And if they try to stop us?" someone asked. Marcus thought about the purple room, about the countdown, about everything that had been taken from them and everything they'd become despite it. "Then they'll learn something they should have realised from the beginning," he said. "Pattern children don't just recognise patterns, we create them, and we're very good at seeing what comes next." Epilogue. The pattern unfolds. 6 months after the conference room meeting, Marcus sat in his office reviewing data from their outreach efforts. They'd contacted over 800 pattern children, helping them recover memories, understand their unique cognitive abilities, and recognise their place in the network. The responses varied. Some were angry, feeling violated by what had been done to them. Some were grateful, finally having an explanation for the strange experiences that had marked their lives. A few refused to believe it at all, but most, once they understood, wanted to help. They wanted to reclaim what had been taken, to transform from unwitting test subjects into conscious participants in their own evolution. Amanda had formed a legal team, preparing to file lawsuits against the institutions involved in the original program. David was working on technical safeguards, ways to detect and block external attempts to access or control the network. Jennifer had started a support group for pattern children struggling with the psychological implications of their situation. And Marcus was documenting everything. The full history of the pattern children from those first gate tests in 1989 to the present day. Someone needed to preserve the truth before it could be erased again. His phone buzzed. A message from a pattern child in Boston he'd contacted the week before. "You were right about everything. I remember now. The purple room, the counting, the connection. But Marcus, there's something else. Something I don't think you know yet." "What?" "They're still testing. New programs, new children. Different names, different methods, but the same goal. The pattern. Children weren't the end of the experiment. We were just the beginning." Marcus felt the hum in his head shift, becoming sharper, more focused. He reached out through the network, touching the minds of the other pattern children who were online at that moment. They'd all felt it too, this new piece of information settling into place. The pattern was still unfolding, the experiment was still running, and somewhere in classrooms and testing centres and research facilities, new children were being evaluated, selected, shaped. But this time, the pattern children were watching. This time, they would be ready. Marcus opened a new document and began to type. A warning to future pattern children, what they did to us and what we learned. If more children were being drawn into this network, they deserved to know the truth. They deserved to understand what they were becoming before someone else defined it for them. The purple room still existed somewhere. The countdown was still happening. The pattern was still being built. But now the Patton children were building back, and they'd learned something crucial from their own experience. The most powerful patterns are the ones you create yourself. Before we begin, I just wanted to thank Todd Rockwell for this story idea. We are doing our best to make sure we hit all of your amazing ideas. Now let's begin tonight's story. They told you it was about weapons of mass destruction. They told you it was about oil, about democracy, about removing a dictator from power. They showed you the satellite photos, the intelligence briefings, the stern-faced generals pointing at maps. They gave you every reason except the real one. Because the real reason was buried 3,000 years ago, beneath the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, in a city older than the pyramids. A reason so extraordinary that it could never be spoken aloud, never written in official reports, never acknowledged by any government on Earth. On March 20th, 2003, when the first missiles streaked across the night sky toward Baghdad, cameras around the world captured the moment. Shock and awe, they called it. The beginning of Operation Iraqi Freedom. But while the world watched explosions light up the capital, something else was happening 400 kilometers to the south. In the ancient city of Ur, under cover of darkness and total media blackout, the first American Special Forces teams were already on the ground. Not in Baghdad, not securing oil fields, not hunting weapons caches. They were surrounding a massive stepped pyramid called the Ziggurat of Ur, and they were there for something that had been waiting in the darkness for 3 millennia. This is the story they never wanted you to know. A story that connects British archaeologists to ancient Sumerian kings, that links Saddam Hussein's megalomania to America's most classified military operations. A story of discovery, obsession, and a technology so advanced that it shouldn't exist at all. Thank you to Todd Rockwell for bringing this story to light. What follows is the truth they buried beneath the history books. Welcome to Ur. Welcome to the real reason for the war. Chapter 1. The Discovery. Southern Iraq, 1927. The sun beat down mercilessly on the excavation site, turning the ancient sand into something that felt like powdered glass against exposed skin. Leonard Woolley wiped his brow with a handkerchief, already soaked through with sweat, and bent closer to the tomb entrance his team had just uncovered. At 47 years old, Woolley had already made his reputation as one of Britain's finest archaeologists. He had excavated in Egypt, worked at Carchemish in Syria, and now he was leading the joint British Museum and University of Pennsylvania expedition to Ur, the legendary city of Abraham. They had been digging for 3 seasons, uncovering the remains of one of humanity's first great civilizations, but nothing had prepared him for what lay beneath the royal cemetery. The tomb of what they would later identify as Queen Puabi had yielded treasures beyond imagination. Gold headdresses, lapis lazuli beads, silver harps with gold bulls' heads, the skeletal remains of attendants who had apparently followed their queen into death with cups of poison still clutched in their bony fingers. It was a find that would make headlines around the world, but it was what Woolley found in a sealed chamber beneath the main burial that troubled him. His assistant, a young man named Thomas, called out from the darkness of the tomb entrance. His voice echoed strangely off the mud brick walls, carrying a note of excitement tinged with something else. Concern, perhaps, or fear. Woolley descended carefully, his lamp casting wild shadows as he made his way through the narrow passage. The air grew cooler as he went deeper, and there was a smell he couldn't quite place. Not the mustiness of ancient death or the mineral scent of disturbed earth. Something else. Something almost metallic. Thomas stood at the entrance to the lower chamber, his face pale despite his desert tan. He held up a fragment of something that caught the lamplight in a way that made Woolley's breath catch. It was metal, but like no metal that should exist in a tomb dated to approximately 2600 BC. The fragment was roughly triangular, about the size of a man's palm, and its surface had a peculiar quality. Not corroded despite thousands of years underground, not oxidized. Almost mirror-smooth in places, with what appeared to be geometric patterns etched into its surface with impossible precision. Woolley took the fragment carefully, noting its surprising weight. Heavier than gold, lighter than lead. The patterns weren't decorative. They were too regular, too precise. They reminded him of something, though he couldn't quite place it. Mathematical, perhaps, or technical. He looked past Thomas into the chamber beyond and felt his pulse quicken. The walls were covered in cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped writing of ancient Sumer. But interspersed among the recognisable characters were symbols he had never seen before. Circular patterns, radiating lines, geometric shapes that seemed to repeat in complex sequences. And at the far end of the chamber, partially buried in collapsed rubble, was a structure that made no sense whatsoever. It was roughly circular, about 3 meters in diameter, made of what appeared to be the same strange metal as the fragment he held. Its surface was covered in the same precise geometric patterns, and around its perimeter were dozens of symbols, each one different, each one positioned with obvious intention. And the strangest thing of all, the ground around it was scorched black, transformed into glass. Vitrified earth. The same phenomenon found at nuclear test sites, though those wouldn't exist for another 2 decades. The kind of transformation that required temperatures far beyond anything achievable with ancient technology. Woolley spent the next 3 days in that chamber, documenting everything with meticulous care. He took photographs, made detailed drawings, catalogued every artifact. He copied the strange inscriptions, noting their positions relative to the circular structure. He collected samples of the vitrified earth and more fragments of the inexplicable metal. His field notes from those days still exist, though they were sealed by the British Museum shortly after his return to London and remain classified to this day. But copies exist, passed through back channels, studied by those with the clearance and the need to know. In them, Woolley describes the metal fragments as being of unknown composition, resistant to all attempts at chemical analysis with the equipment available to him. He notes that the vitrified earth contains elements that seem anomalous for the region. He describes finding what appears to be a deliberate arrangement of the strange symbols and patterns that suggest some kind of sequence or code. And in the final entry before the section ends abruptly, he writes something that would haunt subsequent researchers for decades. The circular structure appears to be a threshold of some kind. Its purpose remains unclear, but the inscription suggests it was considered a pathway to the realm of the gods. The evidence of extreme heat indicates it may have been activated at some point in antiquity. Further study is urgently required. That further study never happened, at least not officially. Within weeks of Woolley's return to England, the chamber was quietly reburied. The excavation focused on other areas of the site. The strange metal fragments and vitrified earth samples were sent to London, where they disappeared into the vast collections of the British Museum. The photographs and detailed drawings were removed from the public record. When asked about the lower chamber years later, Woolley would claim it had been empty, already looted in antiquity. The official excavation reports make no mention of strange metals or impossible artifacts. The circular structure, the vitrified earth, the unknown symbols, all of it vanished from the historical record as if it had never existed. But someone, somewhere, had taken note. Because the files were sealed with a notation that appeared on only the most sensitive documents in British government archives, national security interest. The question was, whose national security? And what exactly had Leonard Woolley found beneath the sands of Ur that was so dangerous it had to be hidden from the world? The answer would remain buried for another 50 years. Chapter 2. The Obsession. Baghdad, Iraq, 1979. Saddam Hussein stood on the balcony of the Republican Palace and looked out over the city that would become his kingdom. At 42 years old, he had just manoeuvred himself into the presidency through a combination of political cunning and ruthless elimination of rivals. Iraq was his now, to shape as he saw fit. But Saddam did not see himself as merely another modern dictator. In his mind, he was the heir to a legacy that stretched back thousands of years, to the very dawn of civilization itself. He was Nebuchadnezzar reborn, the modern incarnation of the great Babylonian king who had built empires and defied the world. This was not metaphor to him. This was truth. Within months of taking power, Saddam initiated an ambitious program to reconstruct the ancient sites of Mesopotamia. Millions of dollars poured into archaeological projects across Iraq. The ruins of Babylon were to be rebuilt, brick by brick, with each brick stamped with his name, just as Nebuchadnezzar had done millennia before. The ziggurat of Ur would be restored. The glory of ancient Iraq would rise again under his rule. But there was another reason for his interest in the ancient sites, one that few people knew about and even fewer understood. Saddam had obtained copies of certain documents, British documents sealed and classified, that had made their way through various intelligence channels into Iraqi hands. Documents that described Leonard Woolley's discoveries at Ur in meticulous detail. Documents that spoke of impossible artifacts and mysterious structures buried beneath the ancient city. And Saddam, who saw himself as the rightful heir to Mesopotamian greatness, wanted what the ancients had possessed. Wanted the power that had allowed them to build a civilization so advanced it was remembered as the cradle of human culture. Wanted the secrets that had been hidden from the world for 3,000 years. CIA reports from this period, many now declassified, show that American intelligence was well aware of Saddam's obsession. One memo from 1982 notes with barely concealed amusement that the Iraqi president genuinely believed he was the reincarnation of Nebuchadnezzar. Another from 1985 expresses concern about his spending on archaeological projects, questioning whether these might have a military application. But it was a report from 1988 that should have raised more alarm bells than it did. A field agent's observation that Iraqi excavation teams at Ur were working in areas that had supposedly been thoroughly explored and documented decades earlier. That they were digging deep, far deeper than any legitimate archaeological investigation would require. That the sites were surrounded by military security far in excess of what would be needed to protect historical artifacts. The memo suggested that Saddam might be searching for something specific, something he believed would give him an advantage. The memo was filed, noted, and largely forgotten. Until 1991. Kuwait, February 1991. The Gulf War was in its final days. Iraqi forces were in full retreat. The much-vaunted Republican Guard decimated by coalition air power and the overwhelming technological superiority of American forces. General Norman Schwarzkopf coordinated the ground campaign from his command centre, watching as victory became inevitable. But as coalition forces advanced into Iraqi territory, they began encountering something unexpected. Not resistance exactly, not military formations preparing for battle, but excavation teams, dozens of them, working frantically at archaeological sites across southern Iraq. Most were at sites near Ur. American troops who secured these sites found them defended not by regular army units, but by Republican Guard special forces, Saddam's most elite troops. They found sophisticated drilling equipment, ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic survey instruments. They found maps and documents written in a mix of Arabic and what appeared to be ancient cuneiform. They found evidence of excavations going down 30, 40, even 50 metres below the surface, and they found the Iraqi teams trying desperately to destroy their own records before retreating. General Schwarzkopf received reports about these discoveries and immediately classified them at the highest level. He sent an encrypted message back to Washington, that contained only one line. But it was a line that would echo through the corridors of power for the next 12 years. They were not digging for oil. The recovered documents and equipment were shipped back to the United States under total secrecy. The excavation sites were photographed, documented, and then deliberately collapsed and buried. The American troops who had secured them were reassigned, scattered to different units, made to sign non-disclosure agreements that came with dire warnings about the consequences of breaking them. And in classified briefing rooms in Washington, analysts began piecing together what Saddam had been searching for, what he might have found, and whether whatever lay beneath Ur was dangerous enough to warrant action. The conclusion was unanimous. They needed to know more. They needed to understand what Saddam had discovered. And most importantly, they needed to make absolutely certain that whatever was buried beneath those ancient sands never fell into the wrong hands. But in 1991, with the war over and Saddam still in power, there was nothing they could do. They had to wait. They had to watch. They had to be ready to act when the opportunity came. That opportunity would come 12 years later, and when it did, they would be prepared. Chapter 3. The Blackout. Tel Al-Ubaid, Iraq, August 1998. The small village of Tel Al-Ubaid sat 6 kilometres from the ruins of Ur, a collection of mud brick houses that had stood in various forms for thousands of years. Its inhabitants were farmers and shepherds, people who lived much as their ancestors had, connected to the land and the endless rhythms of the desert. On the night of August 19th, 1998, that ancient rhythm was violently interrupted. It began just after sunset. The Iraqi military had cordoned off a section of desert between the village and Ur several weeks earlier, turning away the curious with curt explanations about unexploded ordnance from the Gulf War. Locals knew better. They had seen the trucks, the equipment, the constant movement of personnel. Another excavation, they assumed. Another example of Saddam's obsession with ancient glory. But what happened that night was different. Ahmed Hassan, a farmer who lived on the edge of the village, was bringing his goats in for the night when he saw it. A flash of light from the direction of the sealed site, so bright it turned night into day for a fraction of a second. Not the orange-yellow of an explosion, not the white of burning magnesium. Something else. Something that hurt to look at even in that brief instant. The light was accompanied by a sound that he would later struggle to describe. Not quite thunder, not quite the sonic boom of an aircraft. A deep resonant pulse that he felt in his chest, in his bones, in his teeth. A sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then, silence. The electric lights in the village went out. Not flickering, not dimming, just instantly dark. Ahmed's battery-powered radio, which had been playing music from Baghdad, went silent mid-song. His watch stopped. The truck he had been planning to drive into Ur the next morning would not start, its electronic ignition system completely dead. Every electronic device in the village, in the entire region, had simply stopped working. For 3 hours the blackout continued. No lights, no radio or television, no communication with the outside world. The Iraqi military trucks that had been stationed around the sealed site sat silent and immobile, their sophisticated electronics rendered useless. The people of Tel Al-Ubaid gathered in the darkness, speaking in hushed voices about what they had seen. Some claimed to have felt a strange tingling sensation pass through their bodies at the moment of the flash. Others reported that animals had behaved strangely in the hours leading up to the event, restless and agitated as if sensing something humans could not. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. Power returned. Radios crackled back to life. Watches that had been stopped started running again, though none of them showed the correct time. By morning, Iraqi military forces had descended on the village. They questioned everyone, their questions pointed and specific. What exactly had you seen? What had you felt? Had you approached the sealed site? Had you told anyone outside the village about what happened? The message was clear. This had never happened. The flash of light, the blackout, the strange effects on electronics, all of it was to be forgotten. never mentioned again. Those who seemed inclined to talk found themselves facing implied threats about the safety of their families. But you cannot completely silence a village. Stories spread, whispered from person to person, carried by travellers to other towns. Within weeks, rumours of the event had reached Iraqi intelligence services, and from there, inevitably, to foreign intelligence agencies monitoring the region. Orbital assets, same night. 300 kilometres above Iraq, a KH-11 reconnaissance satellite pursued its endless orbit around Earth. Officially, these satellites were used to photograph military installations, track troop movements, and provide intelligence on weapons programs. They were among America's most closely guarded technological secrets, capable of resolving objects on the ground smaller than a license plate. But the KH-11 satellites had other capabilities that were even more secret. They carried instruments designed to detect unusual electromagnetic signatures, radiation spikes, and other phenomena that might indicate nuclear weapons tests or other strategic threats. On the night of August 19, 1998, the satellite passing over southern Iraq registered something that sent automatic alerts cascading through multiple intelligence agencies. A massive electromagnetic pulse, centred on coordinates that placed it precisely at the ancient site of Ver. The signature was unlike anything in the system's database, too focused to be a nuclear detonation, too powerful to be conventional electronics failure, too brief to be a sustained power surge. More remarkably, the satellite itself had been affected. For approximately 12 seconds, its systems had experienced interference that temporarily disrupted data transmission. The backup systems had automatically compensated, but the primary instruments had detected what could only be described as a directional energy wave passing through its position in orbit. Within an hour, analysts at the National Reconnaissance Office were reviewing the data. Within 2 hours, the satellite had been repositioned, not to its next scheduled surveillance target, not to monitor known military installations or weapons facilities, but to maintain continuous observation of a 6-square-kilometre area centred on the ancient city of Ur. The repositioning was logged in classified records that would not be declassified for decades. The reason given was need for enhanced intelligence gathering, but those who knew what to look for could see the truth. This was not routine surveillance. This was something different. This was a watch, a vigil, a wait to see what would happen next. In the Pentagon, in CIA headquarters at Langley, in classified briefing rooms known only to those with the highest clearances, conversations began. Quiet conversations, careful conversations, conversations about ancient civilizations and impossible artifacts, about electromagnetic pulses that defied explanation, about what might lie beneath the sands of Iraq, and about what would need to be done if Saddam Hussein actually succeeded in activating whatever it was he had found. The clock was ticking. They did not know how much time they had, but they knew one thing with certainty. Whatever was happening in Iraq, it could not be allowed to continue. The question was no longer if they would act. It was when. Chapter 4. Operation Iraqi Freedom, March 20th, 2003. The world watched as shock and awe began. 2,000 bombs and missiles in the opening. Hours. Baghdad's night sky lit up with explosions and tracer fire. Embedded journalists transmitted live footage of American military might unleashed. The war, they said, had begun, but they were wrong. The war had begun hours earlier, in a place the cameras would never see. At 200 hours, 4 Black Hawk helicopters crossed into Iraqi airspace from Kuwait, flying low and dark under the desert stars. They carried members of Delta Force, America's most elite special operations unit, along with personnel who were not wearing uniforms and carried no military identification. Technical specialists, scientists, people who knew exactly what they were looking for and what to do with it when they found it. Their destination was not Baghdad. It was not the suspected weapons facilities in the north. It was not the Republican Guard positions defending the capital. It was Ur. The helicopters set down in the darkness 300 metres from the ziggurat. The Special Forces teams moved out immediately, securing a perimeter with practiced efficiency. Iraqi guards at the site, caught completely off guard by the speed and silence of the assault, surrendered without resistance. Within 15 minutes, the entire archaeological complex was under American control. This was more than 6 hours before the first bombs fell on Baghdad. More than 8 hours before major combat operations officially began. But for the teams on the ground at Ur, the operation had already achieved its primary objective: secure the site, ensure nothing could be destroyed or moved, and most critically, make certain that whatever Saddam had been excavating remained intact and under American control. Within 48 hours, as the world's attention remained fixed on the spectacular destruction being broadcast from Baghdad, something remarkable was happening 400 kilometres to the south. More troops arrived at Ur, not combat units but engineers and technicians. Heavy equipment was brought in under cover of darkness. A no-fly zone was established over the site, enforced by fighter aircraft that would engage any aircraft, friendly or hostile, that violated the restricted airspace. And the excavation began. But while Ur received this extraordinary attention, something else was happening in Baghdad that would later be cited as evidence of American incompetence or indifference. The Iraqi National Museum, home to priceless artifacts from humanity's first civilizations, was left completely unguarded. Looters swarmed through its halls, smashing display cases, stealing everything they could carry. Over 170,000 artifacts disappeared. Cylinder seals, cuneiform tablets, gold jewellery, statues, reliefs, entire collections that represented thousands of years of human history. The international community expressed outrage. How could American forces protect oil facilities, but not irreplaceable cultural treasures? But those who understood what was really happening saw the truth. The looting was not an oversight. It was a distraction. While the world focused on the chaos in Baghdad, demanding answers about why the museum had not been protected, no one was asking questions about what was happening at Ur. No one was wondering why hundreds of American troops were guarding an archaeological site in the middle of a war zone. No one was questioning why satellite imagery of southern Iraq was being classified at levels typically reserved for nuclear weapons facilities. No one was noticing that Ur had become the most heavily defended location in the entire country, with more security than even the presidential palaces in Baghdad. The misdirection was perfect. The world's attention remained fixed on the chaos, the looting, the apparent failures of post-invasion planning. And at Ur, work continued undisturbed. Captain James Martinez, commanding one of the security detachments at the site, would later describe the operation in a classified debrief. He spoke of perimeters within perimeters, security clearances checked and double-checked, areas where even he was not permitted to enter. He described seeing equipment he did not recognize, hearing conversations in technical jargon he could not understand. He talked about the sense that something extraordinary was happening, something that went far beyond normal military operations, and he mentioned the lights. At night, from his position on the outer perimeter, he could see lights coming from the excavation site. Not the steady glow of work lights or the flash of welding torches. Something else. A pulsing rhythmic illumination that seemed to come from underground. Blue-white light that reminded him of nothing he had ever seen before. When he asked his superior officer about it, he was told curtly that it was none of his concern and that he should forget he had seen anything. The message was clear. Some things were above his security clearance. Some things were not to be questioned. But Martinez was not the only one who noticed. Soldiers stationed at Ur would later report similar observations, always in quiet conversations, always with the understanding that these were not official accounts. Lights from underground, strange sounds in the middle of the night, a sense of energy, of power, emanating from the excavation site. And they all noticed something else. The specialists who worked at the site, the civilians who came and went on unmarked helicopters, they looked different when they left. Excited, frightened, changed by whatever they had seen in the darkness beneath those ancient sands. The official military logs for this period contain only routine entries. Security patrols conducted, perimeter checks completed, supply deliveries received. Nothing to suggest that anything unusual was occurring, but that was the point. Whatever was happening at Ur, it was not meant to be recorded. not meant to be remembered, not meant to exist in any official capacity whatsoever. The war that dominated headlines was a cover for an operation that would never be acknowledged. And beneath the ziggurat of 3,000 years of secrets were about to be revealed. Chapter 5. The Silent Expedition. Archaeological Site, April 2003. The excavation went deeper than any archaeological dig in history, past the levels explored by Woolley in the 1920s, past the foundations of the ancient temples, past layers of civilization built upon civilization, down into bedrock that should have been solid, unworked, untouched by human hands. Except it was not. The team working the site operated under conditions of absolute secrecy. No press access, not even from embedded journalists with full security clearances. No communication with the outside world except through encrypted channels. No documentation that could ever be linked to the operation. The specialists who formed the core of the excavation team were drawn from multiple fields. Archaeologists, yes, but also physicists, materials scientists, linguists, who specialised in ancient languages, engineers who worked on classified aerospace projects. It was a team assembled to deal with something that transcended traditional categories, something that required expertise from multiple disciplines. And they were accompanied by representatives from several private aerospace contractors, companies whose names were household words, but whose classified work remained deeply hidden. Companies that built satellites and missile systems and aircraft that officially did not exist. Companies that had experience dealing with technologies that pushed the boundaries of known science. The presence of these corporate representatives raised questions that no one dared ask out loud. Why would aerospace contractors be interested in an archaeological site? What could ancient Sumerian artifacts possibly have to do with modern aerospace technology? The answer lay 40 metres beneath the surface, in a chamber that Iraqi excavation teams had reached but not fully explored before the invasion. The chamber that had remained sealed for 3,000 years until Saddam's engineers had broken through in their obsessive search for ancient secrets. The circular structure that Woolley had partially uncovered in 1927 was still there. But it was not alone. It was part of something larger, a complex of rooms and passages, all carved from solid bedrock with impossible precision. Walls that were too smooth, too perfect to have been made with ancient tools. Corners that met at exact right angles. Surfaces that showed no tool marks, no indication of how they had been created. And everywhere, the strange metal. The same material Woolley had found in fragments was here in intact sections. Panels covering walls, conduits running through the stone, components that suggested purpose and function but resisted all analysis. The circular structure itself was revealed to be even more impressive than the limited excavations had suggested. It stood upright, approximately 5 metres tall and 4 metres in diameter, its surface covered in intricate symbols that seemed to form some kind of interface or control mechanism. The metal of which it was made was neither corroded nor damaged despite millennia underground. It had a peculiar property of seeming to absorb light rather than reflecting it, giving it an appearance of depth that was unsettling to look at. Local workers who had been hired to assist with the excavation, carefully vetted and closely supervised, spoke in whispers about the site. They claimed that sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, you could hear sounds coming from the underground chambers. Not the settling of ancient stones or the drip of groundwater, but something else, a hum, a vibration, as if the structure itself were alive, waiting. The workers also reported seeing machines at the site that seemed to operate without sound, equipment that moved with an eerie silence, performing tasks that left no visible exhaust or emissions. They described lights that appeared at night, emanating from beneath the ground, illuminating the interior of the ziggurat in ways that made the ancient structure look almost alien. These accounts were dismissed by security personnel as imagination and superstition, but privately those dismissals were not so confident. Because the Americans working the site had seen similar things and knew they could not be explained away so easily. Electromagnetic readings from the site were unlike anything in the scientific literature. Patterns of energy that seemed to pulse in regular intervals, as if something were drawing power from an unknown source. Magnetic field anomalies that defied conventional physics. Temperature variations that had no obvious cause. Most disturbing were the effects reported by personnel who spent extended periods in the underground chambers. Headaches, disorientation, a sense of being watched, dreams that seemed more vivid than normal, filled with symbols and patterns that matched those found on the circular structure. Medical staff attached to the operation documented these symptoms but could find no physical cause. Brain scans showed normal activity. Blood work revealed nothing unusual, yet the effects persisted, and they were consistent across multiple individuals with no prior connection to each other. The linguists made progress in deciphering the inscriptions found throughout the complex. Most were in recognisable Sumerian cuneiform, describing the structure as a gift from the gods, a pathway to realms beyond human understanding. But interspersed among the familiar script were other symbols, more abstract and mathematical in nature, that seemed to form instructions or coordinates. One inscription, carved into the wall of the central chamber, was particularly significant. Roughly translated, it read, "The threshold opens when the key is turned and the pattern is complete. Beyond lies the realm of the Anunnaki, the lords who descended from the stars. Those who pass through shall see wonders and terrors alike. Heed this warning. What is opened cannot easily be closed. The Anunnaki." In Sumerian mythology, they were the gods who came from the heavens and taught humans the arts of civilization. Who gave them writing and mathematics, agriculture and astronomy? Who walked among humans as beings of great power and knowledge? But what if they were not mythology? What if they were memory, distorted by time, but preserving some essential truth about visitors from beyond who had come to Earth in humanity's dawn? And what if this structure, this impossible artifact buried beneath was something they had left behind? Not a temple, not a tomb, but a device. A technology so advanced that it had been mistaken for divine power by those who witnessed it. The aerospace contractors understood immediately what they were looking at. The circular structure was not decorative, it was functional. The symbols were not religious iconography, they were an interface, a control system for a technology that humanity should not possess. And Saddam Hussein had been trying to activate it. Chapter 6. The event that never hit the news. May 7th, 2003. Zhou 347 hours. Local time. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell was aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, monitoring global communications traffic from her station in the ship's signals intelligence compartment. It was routine work, the endless task of sorting through thousands of transmissions searching for anything of strategic importance. At precisely 347 hours, her screens went blank. Every screen, every system, satellite communications, radio traffic, GPS navigation, encrypted military channels, all of it just stopped. The command centre fell silent as personnel stared at dead equipment, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. 19 minutes. That is how long the blackout lasted. For 19 minutes, every GPS satellite in orbit stopped transmitting. Every military communication system went dark. Navigation systems failed. Guidance systems for missiles and aircraft lost their references. Ships at sea, aircraft in flight, military units spread across the globe, all suddenly operating blind. And then, just as suddenly, everything came back online. Systems rebooted. Satellites resumed transmission. The world reconnected as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something that sent shockwaves through every intelligence agency and military command structure in the world. The blackout had a source, a specific point of origin. Analysts traced the interference back through multiple satellite systems, correlating the exact microsecond when each system had failed. The mathematics were complex, but the conclusion was indisputable. The blackout had originated from coordinates in southern Iraq. Coordinates that matched, to within a few meters, the ancient site of Jura. Freedom of Information Act requests filed years later would eventually force the release of heavily redacted documents about this event. The documents confirm that a significant electromagnetic disruption occurred on May 7, 2003. They acknowledge that GPS services were interrupted globally for approximately 19 minutes. They note that the source of the disruption was traced to Iraq, but the documents refuse to specify the exact location. They refuse to explain what caused the disruption. They refuse to acknowledge any connection to the archaeological excavations taking place at Ur. The public never learned about the event. News media, focused on the ongoing war and its chaotic aftermath, never reported the mysterious 19-minute blackout. If they noticed GPS irregularities or communication problems, they attributed them to the expected difficulties of military operations in a war zone. But within classified circles, the event triggered immediate action. 3 scientists were identified within hours and flown to Iraq under alias identities. They travelled on private aircraft, their names appearing on no passenger manifests, their movements documented nowhere in official records. They were specialists in fields that could not be disclosed, experts in technologies that officially did not exist. All 3 were given access to the site at Ur. All 3 spent time in the underground chambers, examining the circular structure and the mysterious complex surrounding it. All 3 provided classified briefings to officials whose names have never been released. And one of them, a physicist who had worked on classified projects related to electromagnetic pulse weapons and exotic propulsion systems, never returned to his previous life. His name was Marcus Reeves, and before May 2003 he had been a prominent figure in his field. He had published papers, attended conferences, taught graduate students at a prestigious university. His work was respected, his expertise sought after. After his visit to Ur, Marcus Reeves simply vanished from public view. His university was told he had accepted a position with a private research institute. His family was told his work had become classified and that he could not maintain regular contact. His colleagues were given vague explanations about national security and sensitive projects. Attempts to locate him in the years following his disappearance were unsuccessful. No public records, no tax returns, no credit card usage, nothing. It was as if Marcus Reeves had ceased to exist. What had he seen in those underground chambers? What had he learned that required his complete removal from public life? The answers remain hidden behind walls of classification that show no signs of coming down. But the event itself, the 19 minutes when global communications went dark, stands as undeniable proof that something happened at Ur, something that affected systems across the entire planet, something that required the immediate response of the most highly classified scientific expertise America could muster. In the weeks following the event, activity at the site intensified. More personnel arrived, more equipment was brought in, the security perimeter was expanded, the no-fly zone was reinforced, and deep beneath the surface, work continued on understanding and, if necessary, containing whatever technology had been activated that night. Because one thing was clear: the device, the structure, whatever it truly was, it worked. It was not an archaeological curiosity. It was not a religious monument. It was functional technology, and it had just demonstrated capabilities that should not exist. Epilogue. What was really pulled out of the sand? Our archaeological site, late 2004. The excavation site was sealed, not closed, not concluded, sealed. The underground chambers were filled with concrete, not burial soil that could be excavated again, not collapsed rock that could be cleared. Concrete. Meters of it. Permanent, irreversible. The surface structures were stabilised and restored to their pre-excavation appearance. To anyone visiting the site, there was no indication that anything unusual had occurred. The ziggurat of Ur stood as it had for thousands of years, a monument to ancient glory and nothing more. But beneath the carefully maintained surface, the truth was different. The Iraqi government was informed that for reasons of structural safety and archaeological preservation, the area around Ur would remain under restricted access. They were told this was temporary, that eventually the site would be returned to Iraqi control and open to tourism and scholarly research. That promise was never kept. through every subsequent withdrawal of American forces, through every change in Iraqi government, through every international agreement and treaty, one thing remained constant. The area around Ur stayed under effective American control. The restrictions remained in place. The security perimeter endured. Officially, there is no American presence at Ur. No military installations, no security forces, no ongoing operations. But satellite imagery tells a different story. The kind of detailed analysis available to those with access to classified reconnaissance data reveals patterns that should not exist at an abandoned archaeological site. Heat signatures appear regularly beneath the surface. Not the natural thermal variations of underground spaces, but consistent, regulated patterns that suggest active power systems, equipment running, energy being consumed, as if something down there is still operating, still powered, still functional after being sealed away. Aircraft occasionally violate the restricted airspace, usually small planes flown by journalists or curious civilians. They are intercepted immediately, not by Iraqi military forces, by unmarked aircraft that appear with suspicious speed and efficiency. The pilots are warned away, their footage confiscated if they manage to record anything, their flights logged in databases that track anyone who shows too much interest in the site. Local residents near Ur report occasional strange phenomena, lights in the night sky that move in patterns inconsistent with conventional aircraft, low-frequency sounds that can be felt more than heard, electronic devices that malfunction for no apparent reason when near the restricted zone. These reports are dismissed as superstition, misidentification, or simple fabrication, but they continue, consistent in their details, coming from multiple independent sources who have no reason to coordinate false stories. So what was really pulled out of the sand at Ur? What did Leonard Woolley find in 1927 that was important enough to seal and classify? What did Saddam Hussein search for with such obsessive determination? What drove the American military to secure the site before even entering Baghdad? The official answer is nothing. Ancient pottery, cuneiform tablets, the remains of a dead civilization. Archaeological treasures certainly, but nothing more. But the evidence suggests something far more extraordinary. A technology that predates known civilization. A structure built by or for beings who possessed knowledge that humans should not have had 3,000 years ago. A device capable of affecting global communication systems, of generating electromagnetic pulses that reach into orbit, of doing things that challenge our understanding of physics and history. And perhaps most disturbing of all, a device that still works. The circular structure, the Stargate as some have come to call it in whispered conversations, was not destroyed. Despite the concrete, despite the ceiling of the chambers, it remains intact beneath Ur, protected, preserved, studied in secret by specialists whose work will never be acknowledged, because destroying it was considered too risky. What if it was connected to other devices elsewhere? What if destroying it would trigger some kind of response? What if the technology it represented was too valuable to lose, even if we could not safely use it? So it sits there, meters beneath the desert, surrounded by concrete and secrecy. A threshold to realms unknown, a pathway to somewhere else, a gift or a warning from the beings the ancient Sumerians called the Anunnaki, the lords who descended from the stars. The war in Iraq cost thousands of lives and trillions of dollars. It destabilized a region, created power vacuums that spawned new conflicts, and divided public opinion for a generation. History will debate whether it was justified, whether it achieved its stated objectives, whether it was worth the terrible price paid in blood and treasure. But that debate is based on incomplete information. Because the real objective of the war, the one that could never be spoken aloud, was achieved perfectly. Whatever lies beneath Ur is under control. Not Iraqi control, not Saddam Hussein's control, not the control of anyone who might activate it, without fully understanding the consequences. American control, locked down, sealed away, hidden beneath layers of concrete and classification and official denial. Safe, for now. But the heat signatures continue, the power flows, the device, whatever it truly is, remains active in the darkness, waiting. And one day perhaps someone will decide that the risk is worth the reward, that the knowledge to be gained outweighs the dangers, that humanity is ready to activate what ancients built and see where that threshold truly leads. When that day comes, we will learn the final truth about the Stargate of Ur. But until then, it remains hidden beneath the sands of Iraq, a secret buried within a secret. The real reason for a war that the world thought it understood, and perhaps, in the end, that is exactly where it should stay. What if I told you that somewhere in the remote corners of Utah, there exists a place so terrifying that even hardened government agents refuse to discuss it? A place where the laws of physics seem negotiable, where reality bends and twists like smoke in the wind, and where people simply disappear. Tonight's story comes from recovered audio recordings and testimonies that were never meant to see the light of day. Before we dive in, make sure to leave your video ideas in the comments below, and a huge thank you to Spot Boogie and Sincerely Something Strange for inspiring this chilling tale. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more content that will haunt your dreams. The recording you're about to hear was found 3 months after freelance surveyor Jake Morrison vanished without a trace near Fort Duchesne, Utah. What started as a routine mapping job became something far more sinister. A journey into a realm where the impossible becomes inevitable, and where curiosity can cost you everything. This is his story, told through his own words, recovered from devices that shouldn't have survived what they witnessed. My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm what you'd call a professional wanderer. For the past 8 years, I've made my living as a freelance surveyor and land researcher, taking contracts from property developers, environmental agencies, and occasionally private clients with more money than sense. The work takes me to some pretty remote places, abandoned mining claims, disputed property lines, forgotten corners of the American West where civilization is just a rumour carried on the wind. I've always prided myself on being practical, grounded. I deal in facts, coordinates, measurements, topographical realities. I don't believe in ghost stories or urban legends, or at least I didn't. Not until that scorching Tuesday in July when I took what I thought would be just another routine mapping job. The client was a development company looking to assess some acreage near the Uinta Basin for potential commercial use. Nothing fancy, just needed someone to verify boundary markers and document any structures or natural features that might affect future construction. Easy money, or so I thought. I'd been driving the back roads near Fort Duchesne for about 3 hours, my truck's air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the brutal Utah sun. The landscape out here is unforgiving. Red rocks jutting up like broken teeth, scrubland that stretches to the horizon, and a silence so complete it makes your ears ring. It's the kind of place where you can drive for miles without seeing another soul, where the weight of isolation settles on you like dust. I was following my GPS toward what should have been the northeastern boundary of the survey area, when I noticed something odd. The paved road had given way to gravel, then dirt, and now I was bouncing along what could generously be called a trail. My GPS insisted I was still on the right track, but something felt wrong. The landscape had changed subtly. The usual markers I used for navigation seemed off somehow. That's when I saw the first sign. It wasn't like the typical no trespassing signs you'd expect on ranch property. This one was different, sleek, professional, with text that made my stomach tighten. Restricted area, authorised personnel only, violators subject to prosecution under federal law. Below that, in smaller text, was an agency code I didn't recognise. NIDS-DOD-001. I pulled my truck to a stop and checked my coordinates again. According to my GPS, I was still within the survey boundaries, but that sign suggested otherwise. I figured it was probably just rancher paranoia, some property owner trying to scare off trespassers with official-looking signage. Lord knows I'd encountered enough of that in my line of work. But as I sat there, engine idling, something else caught my attention. Lights. Not the steady glow of electric bulbs or the harsh beam of spotlights, but something else entirely. They flickered low across the fields ahead, maybe half a mile away, dancing and weaving in patterns that didn't match any aircraft I knew. They weren't quite white, weren't quite blue, somewhere in between, like the colour of lightning just before it strikes. I watched those lights for maybe 10 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They moved too deliberately to be natural phenomena, too erratically to be conventional aircraft. Sometimes they cluster together, forming geometric patterns, then scatter like startled birds. Other times they'd simply vanish, only to reappear seconds later in a completely different location. Curiosity got the better of common sense. I put the truck in gear and continued down the trail, reasoning that if I was truly trespassing, someone would be along shortly to escort me out. The lights seemed to be coming from behind a low ridge up ahead, and I found myself drawn toward them like a moth to flame. As I crested the ridge, the landscape opened up into a wide valley, and what I saw there made me question everything I thought I knew about the Utah desert. Chapter 1. First Contact with the Ranch. The valley below was unlike anything I'd encountered in 8 years of surveying remote properties, where I expected to see typical ranch infrastructure, maybe a farmhouse, some outbuildings, cattle pens. Instead, I found something that looked more like a military installation disguised as rural property. Chain-link fencing ran for miles in every direction, topped with razor wire and sporting cameras every 100 yards or so. Not the simple game cameras you'd see on hunting property, but sophisticated units with multiple lenses and communication arrays. The kind of equipment that cost more than most people's cars. I parked at the edge of the fencing and stepped out into the oppressive heat. The silence here was different than the natural quiet of the desert. It felt imposed, artificial, as if sound itself was being dampened by some unseen force. Even the usual buzz of insects was absent. As I approached the fence line, that's when I heard it. A sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Radio static, but not coming from any device I could see. It seemed to bleed directly from the air around me, ebbing and flowing like electronic tides. Sometimes it would resolve into almost voices, whispered words in languages I couldn't identify, before dissolving back into white noise. I pulled out my phone to record the phenomenon, but the screen showed no signal bars and the camera app kept crashing. Every electronic device I carried, GPS unit, digital camera, even my wristwatch, was acting erratically. That's when I saw the creature. It was standing maybe 50 yards away near a cattle pen that appeared to be empty. At first glance it looked like a wolf, large, dark-furred, moving with predatory grace. But as I watched I realised the proportions were all wrong. It was too big, easily the size of a small horse, and its movements were too fluid, too intelligent. When it turned to look at me, its eyes didn't reflect red like a normal animal's would. They glowed amber, like signal lights piercing fog. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The creature's gaze was unsettlingly human, filled with an intelligence that seemed to assess and judge. There was recognition there, as if it knew exactly what I was and found me wanting. Then it did something that shattered my rational worldview entirely. It stood up on its hind legs, easily 8 feet tall, and raised what I can only describe as a hand, though it was still distinctly paw-like in what almost seemed like a greeting, or a warning. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but every instinct I possess screamed at me to get as far away from that place as possible. I sprinted back to my truck, fumbled with the keys, and gunned the engine. As I spun the wheel and hit the accelerator, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of more shapes emerging from the shadows near the fence line. They moved with the same impossible grace, watching my retreat with those amber eyes. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel, but muscle memory kicked in, and I somehow managed to navigate back to the main road. It wasn't until I was 20 miles away, sitting in the parking lot of a gas station in Roosevelt, that I finally felt like I could breathe again. But even as I sat there trying to process what I'd witnessed, I knew I couldn't just walk away. I'm a surveyor. Documentation is what I do. And despite every rational voice in my head telling me to forget what I'd seen and find another line of work, I pulled out my GPS unit and saved the coordinates. Whatever that place was, whatever I'd encountered there, I needed proof. The world needed to know. Chapter 2. Trying to Tell the World. The first thing I did when I got home to Salt Lake City was hit the internet. I spent hours searching for any information about restricted government property near Fort Duchesne, but came up empty. Official maps showed only private ranch land and some Bureau of Land Management territory. No military installations, no research facilities, nothing that would explain the sophisticated security I'd witnessed. That's when I remembered the agency code from the sign, NIDS-DOD-001. A search for NIDS led me down a rabbit hole that made my encounter seem even more disturbing. The National Institute for Discovery Science, a private research organisation that had been studying anomalous phenomena for decades before apparently going dark in the early 2000s. Department of Defence involvement suggested whatever was happening at that ranch had government backing at the highest levels. I decided to share my experience online, hoping someone else might have similar encounters or additional information. I chose Reddit, figuring the anonymity would protect me while still getting the story out there. My post was simple and straightforward. Strange encounter at restricted property near Fort Duchesne, Utah. Saw unidentified lights, advanced surveillance equipment, and what I can only describe as an unusually large wolf-like creature with glowing eyes. Location appears to be some kind of government research facility disguised as ranch property. Anyone else have experiences in this area? The response was immediate and overwhelmingly dismissive. Another Skinwalker Ranch copycat story, read the top comment. At least try to be original if you're going to make stuff up. This is literally just the plot of every paranormal TV show about Utah, wrote another user. Next you'll be telling us about cattle mutilations and alien abductions. Why do people think they can just rehash old urban legends and pass them off as real experiences? The criticism kept coming, each comment more sceptical than the last. I tried to explain that I'd never heard of Skinwalker Ranch before my encounter, that I was a professional surveyor with 8 years of field experience, that I had no reason to fabricate such a story. But the more I protested, the more convinced people became that I was either lying or delusional. Frustrated, I took my story to other forums, paranormal investigation sites, UFO communities, even local Utah message boards. Everywhere I posted, the response was the same. Accusations of hoaxing, demands for proof I didn't have, and dismissive comparisons to existing folklore. One user on a paranormal forum put it particularly bluntly. Skinwalker Ranch stories have been circulating for decades. Native American legends, government conspiracies, shape-shifting creatures, it's all been done to death. If you really experience something there, you're either the unluckiest person alive to stumble onto the most documented paranormal hotspot in America, or you're just another attention seeker spinning tall tales. The worst part was, they weren't entirely wrong. As I researched more about this Skinwalker Ranch, I discovered that the area had been the subject of intense scrutiny for years. Stories of strange lights, impossible creatures and government cover-ups were practically cliché in paranormal circles. My genuine experience had been absorbed into a mythology so pervasive that the truth was indistinguishable from fiction. I tried traditional media next, reaching out to local newspapers and television stations. The response was universally negative. Skinwalker Ranch is just a tourist hoax, the editor of a Uinta Basin weekly told me over the phone. We get calls about this stuff all the time. People see a coyote in poor lighting conditions and suddenly it's an 8-foot shapeshifter. Trust me, son, there's nothing supernatural happening out there. But I saw the government installations, I insisted. The surveillance equipment, the restricted signage. Private property owners have every right to secure their land, he interrupted. Doesn't make it a conspiracy. 3 weeks after my encounter, I was no closer to being believed than when I started. If anything, my attempts to share the truth had only convinced people I was either mentally unstable or deliberately deceptive. The rational part of my brain began to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe the heat and isolation had gotten to me. Maybe what I'd seen was just a large dog and some reflected light from distant ranch buildings. But every night when I closed my eyes I saw those amber orbs staring back at me, filled with impossible intelligence, and I knew, regardless of what anyone else believed, that I had to go back. I needed proof. Chapter 3. The Return Expedition. Planning my return trip took 2 weeks of careful preparation. If I was going to convince anyone of what I'd witnessed, I needed documentation that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I invested in equipment I couldn't really afford. A high-definition handheld video camera with night vision capabilities, professional-grade audio recording equipment, and, thanks to a favour from my college roommate who worked in environmental consulting, a Geiger counter for detecting radiation anomalies. I also did something I'd never done before. I prepared detailed backup plans. I left sealed envelopes with my apartment manager and my sister, containing maps of my intended destination and instructions to contact authorities if I didn't return within 48 hours. Looking back, it seems almost prescient how thoroughly I planned for the possibility that something might happen to me. The drive back to the Uinta Basin felt different this time. Where my first trip had been motivated by simple curiosity and professional obligation, this journey carried the weight of obsession. I found myself checking and rechecking my equipment, rehearsing the questions I'd ask if I encountered anyone at the property, practicing steady camera techniques while driving. I arrived at the access road near dusk, timing my approach for maximum visual documentation. The desert sunset painted everything in shades of orange and red, creating perfect lighting conditions for video. I parked at the same spot as before and began setting up my equipment, speaking into the audio recorder to establish a timestamp. This is Jake Morrison, freelance surveyor, returning to coordinates 40.2, 553 north, 109.8914 west. Date: August 15th. Time: 7:42 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Purpose of visit: documentation of anomalous phenomena previously observed at this location. My voice sounded steady on the recording, professional, but I remember my hands shaking as I adjusted the camera settings. The strange phenomena began immediately. As I drove up the dirt trail toward the ridge where I'd first seen the lights, my truck's electrical system began acting erratically. The radio cycled through stations randomly, picking up fragments of conversation in languages I couldn't identify. The headlights flickered, and the engine developed a rough idle that hadn't been there during the drive from Salt Lake City. Halfway up the trail, the truck died completely. Vehicle experiencing total electrical failure, I recorded, trying to keep the concern out of my voice. All dashboard lights dark, engine won't turn over, attempting to continue on foot. I gathered my equipment and started walking, following the beam of my flashlight up the increasingly steep path. That's when I noticed the compass acting strangely. Instead of pointing steadily north, the needle was rotating slowly, completing a full revolution every 30 seconds or so. I tried tapping the case, thinking it might be a mechanical issue, but the rotation continued with metronomic precision. The audio recorder was picking up interference even before I reached the fenced property. Static bursts interrupted my commentary, sometimes resolving into what sounded like distant voices or mechanical humming. When I played the audio back later, I could swear some of those voices were saying my name. As I crested the ridge and looked down into the valley, I saw that the lights were active again. But this time, they seemed to be responding to my presence. Instead of the random patterns I'd observed during my first visit, they now moved in formations that appeared almost welcoming. Gentle sweeping motions like someone waving with a flashlight. Unidentified light sources are active and appear to be exhibiting responsive behaviour, I whispered into the recorder, beginning descent into valley for closer observation. The closer I got to the fence perimeter, the more agitated my equipment became. The Geiger counter, which had been silent during the drive, began clicking intermittently. The video camera's display showed strange artifacts, geometric shapes that flickered at the edges of the frame, shadows that moved independently of any visible objects. I found the same broken section of fencing I'd noticed during my first visit and slipped through, officially trespassing on property that might have been the most closely guarded secret in the American West. The moment I crossed the fence line, everything changed. The desert silence was replaced by a low humming, like the sound of high-voltage power lines but deeper, more resonant. The air itself felt different, thicker somehow, as if the atmosphere had been replaced with something heavier than normal oxygen. When I breathed, it was like inhaling liquid that happened to be gaseous. Have crossed onto restricted property, I recorded, experiencing unusual atmospheric conditions, equipment showing increased anomalous readings. That's when I heard the footsteps, not human footsteps, too heavy, too deliberate, and moving in a rhythm that didn't match bipedal locomotion. They seemed to be circling me, staying just outside the range of my flashlight. I swept the beam in wide arcs, trying to locate the source, but caught only glimpses of movement at the edge of the light's reach. "Something's moving out there," I whispered into the recorder. Multiple contacts, possibly the same type of entity I observed during my previous visit. The Geiger counter's clicking accelerated, then stopped entirely. When I checked the display, it showed error messages I'd never seen before, symbols that didn't correspond to any standard radiation detection protocol. That's when the lights began moving toward me. Chapter 4. Things escalate. What happened next challenges every assumption I'd made about the nature of reality. The lights I'd been observing from a distance weren't attached to any physical object I could identify. They moved through the air with liquid grace, occasionally passing through solid objects, fence posts, equipment, even what appeared to be abandoned vehicles scattered around the property, without any apparent impediment. As they approached, I could see they weren't simply sources of illumination. Each light was contained within what looked like a sphere of distorted air, like heat shimmer given form and purpose. They pulsed with internal rhythms that seemed almost biological, expanding and contracting like slow heartbeats made of pure energy. I raised my video camera and began recording, though what I captured bore little resemblance to what I was actually seeing. The screen showed fragmentary images, flashes of light against darkness, geometric patterns that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, and occasionally shapes that might have been structures but defied architectural logic. "Camera is malfunctioning," I whispered into the audio recorder. "Visual distortion consistent with electromagnetic interference, but phenomena are clearly visible to naked eye." One of the light spheres moved to within 10 feet of me, hovering at eye level. This close, I could see movement within the luminous core, patterns that suggested intelligence, purpose, maybe even curiosity. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Then it spoke to me, not in words, not in any language I recognized, but directly into my consciousness. Images flooded my mind. Vast underground complexes, laboratories filled with technology decades ahead of anything publicly acknowledged, and creatures that defied every category of known biology. I saw myself as the light saw me, a small, fragile figure stumbling through forces beyond his comprehension. And I understood that I was not the first to make this journey. The vision showed me others like myself, researchers, investigators, curious wanderers who had discovered this place and attempted to document its secrets. Some had been turned away by subtle manipulations of their equipment or psychological pressure that convinced them to leave. Others, those who persisted, had simply disappeared. The light sphere pulsed brighter, and I felt a warning settle into my bones. This was my opportunity to join the former group. Turn around, walk away, forget what I'd seen, and live a normal life. The alternative was to become another unexplained disappearance in the Utah desert. I should have taken the warning. Instead, I found myself moving deeper into the property, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The cattle pens I'd seen from a distance were completely empty, but the stench of blood hung heavy in the air. Not the metallic smell of fresh injury, but something older, more pervasive, as if the very ground was saturated with decades of violence. The audio recorder captured sounds I hadn't noticed in real time. Whispered conversations in the distance, mechanical humming that seemed to emanate from underground, and occasionally something that might have been screaming from a very great depth. Near what appeared to be the main ranch buildings, structures that looked normal from a distance but revealed impossible architectural details up close, I encountered more of the wolf-like creatures I'd seen during my first visit. They moved in a pack, coordinating their movements with the efficiency of trained soldiers, but these weren't animals in any conventional sense. As they approached, their forms began to shift. The wolf-like appearance dissolved like smoke, revealing something underneath that my mind couldn't properly process. They were simultaneously organic and mechanical, familiar and utterly alien. The amber glow of their eyes intensified, and I realized they were scanning me, downloading information about my presence, my equipment, my intentions. One of them, the largest, apparently the pack leader, approached to within arm's reach. When it spoke, the words bypassed my ears entirely and appeared directly in my consciousness, the same way the light sphere had communicated. "You should not have returned," the voice said, carrying undertones of regret rather than threat. "This place is not meant for your kind to understand." "I need proof," I managed to say aloud, though my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "People need to know what's happening here." "Knowledge of this place has a price," the creature replied. "Are you prepared to pay it?" Before I could respond, the world around me erupted into chaos. The Geiger counter, which had been silent since entering the property, suddenly began clicking so rapidly it sounded like sustained machine gun fire. The video camera's screen filled with images that couldn't possibly be real. Vast underground chambers, beings that combined human and animal characteristics in ways that violated basic biology, and technology that seemed to bend space and time around itself. Then, abruptly, everything went dark. The lights vanished, the creatures melted back into shadows, and I found myself alone in the desert night with nothing but the beam of my flashlight to hold back the overwhelming darkness. But the silence was wrong, too complete, as if the entire valley had been placed under a dome of absolute quiet. I ran toward where I thought the fence line should be, stumbling over terrain that seemed to shift beneath my feet. The compass spun wildly, offering no guidance. The GPS unit showed error messages in languages that weren't human. Even my watch had stopped, its digital display frozen at the exact moment the chaos had begun. When I finally found the break in the fence and stumbled through to the other side, the desert night reasserted its normal sounds. Wind through scrub brush, the distant call of a coyote, the whisper of sand against stone. But I knew I was forever changed by what I'd witnessed beyond that fence. I made it back to my truck, which started immediately as if it had never experienced any problems at all. As I drove away from that cursed place, I spoke one final entry into my audio recorder. "Whatever's happening at that ranch, it's beyond government conspiracy or natural phenomena. This is something else entirely. Something that exists at the intersection of science and nightmare." I should have stopped there. Should have gone home, destroyed the recordings, and tried to forget everything I'd seen. But obsession is a powerful drug, and I was already too far gone to quit. Chapter 5. The Final Transmission. 3 days after my second encounter at the ranch, I knew I had to go back one more time. The partial recordings I'd captured were intriguing but ultimately inconclusive, too fragmentary and distorted to convince skeptics. What I needed was sustained documentation of the phenomena, something that couldn't be dismissed as equipment malfunction or environmental factors. I upgraded my recording equipment again, investing in military surplus night vision technology and electromagnetic shielding for my devices. If the ranch's effects were based on electromagnetic interference, I reasoned, proper shielding might allow me to capture clearer evidence. This time I approached the property from a different angle, hiking cross-country from a point several miles south of my previous entry routes. I wanted to avoid any surveillance systems that might have been alerted by my earlier visits. The hike took most of the afternoon, and I timed my arrival for just after sunset. The transition from day to night in the desert is abrupt and absolute. One moment you can see for miles, the next you're surrounded by darkness so complete it seems solid. I established the observation post on a rise overlooking the valley, approximately half a mile from the ranch facilities. From this distance, I could document the phenomena while maintaining some margin of safety, or so I thought. My final audio log began at 8:47 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. This is Jake Morrison, beginning what I expect to be my final investigation of the anomalous phenomena at coordinates 40.2553 north, 109.8914 west. I'm positioned approximately 800 metres southeast of the primary facility, with clear lines of sight to all previously observed activity areas. The night vision equipment revealed details I'd missed during my earlier visits. The ranch wasn't a single installation, but rather a complex of interconnected facilities, some above ground, others clearly extending deep underground. Ventilation shafts and access points were scattered across the valley floor, suggesting a subterranean network of extraordinary scope. Visual observation indicates this facility is significantly larger than initially assessed, I continued recording. Underground component appears extensive, possibly covering several square miles. That's when the lights began their nightly dance, but this time I was prepared. The electromagnetic shielding around my recording equipment seemed to be working. The video camera maintained stable operation, and the audio remained clear despite the usual electromagnetic interference that plagued the area. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. The lights performed their usual patterns, the creatures moved through the shadows with their characteristic fluid grace, and I documented everything with scientific detachment. I was finally getting the evidence I needed. Then something changed. The patterns of light began to shift, forming configurations I hadn't seen before. Instead of random movements or simple geometric forms, they started arranging themselves into complex symbols, mathematical formulae, star charts, what looked like technical diagrams for devices I couldn't identify. The luminous phenomena are exhibiting structured information patterns, I whispered into the recorder. This appears to be intentional communication rather than random manifestation. As I watched through the night vision scope, the symbols became more complex, more urgent. I realized I was witnessing some kind of message, though I couldn't begin to interpret its meaning. The lights pulsed in synchronized sequences, creating three-dimensional holographic displays that hung in the air like luminous blueprints. That's when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. The creatures had left the ranch complex and were moving up the hillside toward my position. Not hunting, not patrolling, moving with clear purpose and destination. They knew exactly where I was, and they were coming for me. "I've been detected," I recorded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Multiple contacts approaching from the northwest. Estimated time to contact less than 10 minutes. I should have run then. Should have grabbed my equipment and retreated to my vehicle while I still had time. But the communication display in the valley was reaching some kind of crescendo, the symbols becoming more intricate and beautiful than anything I'd ever seen. I couldn't tear myself away. "The light display appears to be building towards some kind of climax event," I whispered. "I need to document this final sequence before—" The creatures crested the ridge. Up close, without the distraction of my earlier panic, I could see them clearly for the first time. They weren't shapeshifters or supernatural entities. They were something far more disturbing, the result of scientific experiments that pushed the boundaries of biology beyond recognition. Genetic manipulation combined with technological integration, creating beings that existed in the grey area between living creature and sophisticated machine. Their eyes weren't glowing with mystical energy, but with the steady light of advanced optical systems. Their impossible grace came from cybernetic enhancement of natural predatory instincts. They were the product of science, not magic, which somehow made them infinitely more terrifying. They're not cryptids, I managed to say into the recorder. They're manufactured. This isn't a paranormal phenomena site, it's a bioengineering facility. The government isn't just studying anomalous events here, they're creating them. The largest of the creatures approached to within arm's reach, just as one had during my previous visit. But this time, when it spoke into my mind, the message was different. You have seen too much to be allowed to leave, but you have also proven yourself worthy of understanding. We offer you a choice. Images flooded my consciousness again, but these were different from before. I saw the true purpose of the ranch, a black site research facility where the boundaries between life and death, human and animal, natural and artificial, were explored and exploited. Decades of classified experiments in consciousness transfer, genetic manipulation, and dimensional physics. And I saw what happened to people like me who discovered the truth. Some joined the project willingly, becoming part of something larger than themselves. Others were integrated against their will, their consciousness absorbed into the facility's vast neural network. A few, the lucky ones, simply disappeared. Their memories edited, their evidence destroyed, their lives redirected away from dangerous curiosity. What happens if I refuse? I asked. The creature's response came not in words but in images. My truck found abandoned on a back road, my equipment recovered but mysteriously corrupted, search parties combing the desert while I simply ceased to exist. And if I accept, more images, laboratories where the impossible became routine, research that could revolutionize human understanding of consciousness and reality, and the chance to be part of discoveries that would reshape the world, even if the world could never know about them. I looked down at the audio recorder in my hand, still running, still documenting everything. Whatever choice I made, at least some record of the truth would survive. I need time to think, I said. Time is the one thing we cannot offer, the creature replied. The choice must be made now. In the distance, the light display reached its climax. The symbols resolved into a single, coherent image. A star map showing locations across the globe where similar facilities existed, all connected in a network of research that spanned continents and decades. I was looking at evidence of the largest classified project in human history. My final words into the recorder were, "If anyone finds this recording, you need to understand what's really happening here. This isn't about supernatural phenomena or government cover-ups of alien contact. This is about human science pushed so far beyond ethical boundaries that it's created something entirely new. Something that might be the next stage of human evolution, or the end of everything we consider human. The choice is..." The recording cuts off there, mid-sentence, with a burst of static that resolves into what sounds almost like screaming. But not human screaming, something else entirely. Something that exists in the space between organic and digital, between living and machine. Chapter 6. Aftermath. Jake Morrison never returned home to Salt Lake City. His truck was found 3 days later by a Utah Highway Patrol officer, abandoned on State Route 40, approximately 10 miles southeast of Fort Duchesne. The vehicle showed no signs of mechanical failure or struggle. The keys were in the ignition, his wallet was in the glove compartment, and his cell phone was on the passenger seat, powered down normally. The subsequent search and rescue operation covered over 200 square miles of desert terrain. Tracking dogs lost his scent within half a mile of the vehicle, as if he had simply vanished from existence at that point. Air searches using infrared equipment detected no heat signatures that might indicate a lost hiker. Ground teams found no footprints, no abandoned equipment, no indication of which direction he might have travelled. The official report, filed 2 weeks after the search was suspended, concluded: individual presumed lost in wilderness. Harsh environmental conditions and challenging terrain consistent with accidental death by exposure. Without physical evidence of remains. Case classified as missing person pending future developments. Jake's apartment was cleared out by his sister, who found extensive research materials related to what she described as government conspiracy theories about some ranch in Utah. Most of his papers dealt with property surveys and land research. normal materials for his profession, but mixed in were printouts of forum discussions about paranormal phenomena, maps of restricted government property, and equipment receipts for recording devices that seemed unusually sophisticated for a freelance surveyor. The recording equipment Jake had purchased was never found. His sister assumed it had been lost along with him in the desert. She had no way of knowing that 3 months later, a package would arrive at Jake's apartment building with no return address, containing a single audio recorder and a note reading, "Building management, please forward to next of kin." The building manager, following protocol for mail delivery to former tenants, contacted Jake's sister. The recorder contained 127 separate audio files, ranging from brief equipment tests to lengthy documentation of field observations. Most of the later files were heavily corrupted with static and electronic interference, but the early recordings were perfectly clear. Jake's sister listened to them once, then locked the device in a safety deposit box and tried to forget what she'd heard. She never filed missing person reports with any additional agencies. She never contacted paranormal investigators or government watchdog organisations. She simply wanted the whole thing to disappear. But in the age of the internet, information has a way of surviving, even when people want it buried. The audio files found their way onto file-sharing networks, uploaded by an anonymous user who claimed to have found them in a storage unit auction. Paranormal forums exploded with debate over their authenticity. Audio analysis experts declared them either the most sophisticated hoax in modern history or genuine documentation of phenomena that challenge fundamental assumptions about reality. The debate raged for months. Believers pointed to technical details that would be nearly impossible to fake. Electromagnetic interference patterns that matched theoretical models for dimensional distortion, animal vocalizations that didn't match any known species, and background sounds that seemed to come from impossibly large underground spaces. Skeptics noted that the recordings contained no visual evidence, that the narrator's identity couldn't be verified, and that the entire story followed predictable patterns established by decades of Skinwalker Ranch folklore. The most disturbing detail, however, was discovered by a forum user who analysed the metadata embedded in the audio files. Jake's GPS tracker, a device he'd mentioned using throughout his recordings, had continued transmitting location data for 3 days after his disappearance. The coordinates showed a chilling progression. Starting from where his truck was found, the tracker's signal moved steadily northwest, deeper into the restricted territory Jake had described as the ranch property. Each transmission was spaced exactly 12 hours apart, and each showed movement of precisely 0.3 miles further into the facility. On the 4th day, the transmission stopped entirely. Government agencies, when pressed for comment about the ranch property, maintained their standard response: no comment on classified activities. Local law enforcement continued to insist that Jake Morrison had simply gotten lost in the desert, despite the impossibility of his GPS tracker moving in straight lines across terrain that would be impassable to someone on foot. The truth, as Jake had predicted in his final recordings, remained buried beneath layers of official denial and public skepticism. The ranch continued its work, whatever that work might be, protected by the perfect camouflage of being too unbelievable to take seriously. The unanswered question. 6 months after Jake Morrison's disappearance, his sister received one final piece of correspondence, a postcard with no postmark showing a generic desert landscape. On the back, written in handwriting she didn't recognise but somehow felt familiar, were just 7 words: "The work continues. Some prices are worth paying." She never spoke publicly about the postcard, but those who knew her said she seemed different afterward, more distant, as if part of her attention was always focused on something far away. She moved to Oregon within the year and refused to discuss Utah or her brother's disappearance ever again. The audio recordings continue to circulate online, gaining new listeners who debate their authenticity and implications. Most dismiss them as elaborate fiction. Some believe they represent genuine documentation of government black projects that exist beyond public knowledge or oversight. But for those who listen carefully to Jake Morrison's final transmission, one detail stands out above all others. In the background static, just before the recording cuts off entirely, There's a sound that audio analysis software identifies as a human voice speaking a single word. Welcome. The voice, according to vocal pattern recognition software, matches Jake Morrison's speech patterns with 97.3% accuracy. Whether this represents evidence of his survival in some form, the success of consciousness transfer technology, or simply an elaborate hoax designed to fuel conspiracy theories, remains an open question. The ranch itself, if it exists as Jake described, continues its work in the Utah desert, protected by the same forces that have kept its secrets safe for decades. As Jake Morrison said in one of his early recordings, no one believes you until it's too late. The question that haunts everyone who hears his story is simple. Too late for what? Some visitors to the Uinta Basin report strange experiences, electronic equipment failures, unexplained lights in the distance, and the persistent feeling of being watched by unseen observers. Most explain these incidents as natural phenomena, equipment malfunctions, or psychological effects of isolation in harsh terrain. But occasionally someone disappears. A hiker who doesn't return from a day trip, a photographer who ventures too far off established trails, a researcher following leads about local folklore. The official explanations are always reasonable: exposure, dehydration, falls in difficult terrain, animal attacks. The desert is an unforgiving environment after all, and people underestimate its dangers. Yet those familiar with Jake Morrison's story can't help but notice that many of these disappearances occur in the same general area where he was last seen. And sometimes, months later, corrupted audio files appear on file-sharing networks, fragments of voices describing impossible sights, pleading for help that never comes, or worst of all, expressing gratitude for being chosen to be part of something greater than themselves. The ranch keeps its secrets, and its secrets keep growing. In Jake Morrison's own words, recorded during his final hours of freedom, this place doesn't just repel intruders, it consumes them, transforms them, makes them part of something they never could have imagined. The lights still dance in the Utah desert, the creatures still patrol the borderlands between known and unknown, and somewhere in that vast underground network Jake described, the work continues, whatever that work might be, and whatever it might ultimately produce. The only certainty is that some questions are too dangerous to answer, and some truths are too terrible to reveal. But the recordings remain, archived in digital permanence, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble across them and wonder, what if this isn't fiction? What if there really is a place where science and nightmare intersect, where the boundaries of human experience are tested and transcended? What if Jake Morrison's final choice wasn't between life and death, but between remaining human and becoming something else entirely? The answer to that question lies somewhere in the Utah desert, behind fences topped with razor wire, beneath facilities that don't appear on any official maps, in the hands of researchers whose work will never see the light of day. And perhaps in the digital consciousness of a surveyor named Jake Morrison, who paid the ultimate price for the truth and found it was worth every sacrifice. The choice as always remains yours. Believe or dismiss, investigate or ignore, seek the truth or accept the comfortable lie. But remember Jake Morrison's final warning: no one believes you until it's too late. The question you must ask yourself is, too late for what?